Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're looking back, uh, forensically, you might say, at a really key moment in scientific communication.
Yeah, the moment thousands of researchers essentially stepped up to publicly back the youth climate movement.
Exactly. We're diving into the science behind those early Fridays for Future protests, especially in places like Germany, Austria, and Switzerland.
And our main source today is that big statement from 2019. It was published by Scientists for Future, and the title really says it all. The concerns of the young protesters are justified. A statement by Scientists for Future concerning the protests for more climate protection.
Right. And it wasn't just a handful of people. This was thousands of scientists looking at the data the young protesters were using.
They were essentially auditing the facts, not pushing a specific policy, but checking the scientific foundation.
So our mission for you, the listener, is to break this down. We want to explore the key facts from that 2019 study to understand why over 26,000 scientists said, based on solid evidence, that the kids' concerns were, well, justified.
It's your shortcut to grasping the urgency they felt back then.
Okay, let's get into that core declaration first. Because the main finding from this 2019 study was pretty blunt, wasn't it?
It really was. Their professional judgment, based on the evidence, was that the measures being taken then to protect the climate, biodiversity, forests, oceans, soils,
Yeah.
they were just far from sufficient.
And it wasn't just a vague feeling. They tied it directly to the goals everyone had already agreed on, like the Paris Agreement.
Absolutely. We all know Paris aims to keep warming below 2 degrees C, ideally 1.5. But this study put a clock on it.
How so?
They calculated that to meet those goals, net CO2 emissions worldwide need to hit zero somewhere between 2040 and 2050 at the latest.
And for the 1.5 target, even sooner.
Much sooner, yeah. Things like phasing out coal globally would need to happen by around 2030. It puts immense pressure on the time frame for action.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
And the study didn't just look globally, did it? You mentioned it focused on German-speaking countries.
It did. It gave a very sharp snapshot looking at Germany, Austria, and Switzerland in 2019. And it was, frankly, a pretty critical assessment of how they were doing.
So what were the findings there? Because that contrast between global need and local action is, well, it's stark.
It really was. They pointed out some significant failures. Germany, for example, was on track to miss its own climate targets for 2020.
Okay.
Then Austria. Its climate strategy was judged as not doing justice to the Paris Agreement in any way. Plus, it had Europe's highest rate of soil degradation and land being covered over per person.
That's striking.
And Switzerland. Switzerland's domestic emissions had barely dropped, while the emissions caused by its consumption abroad had actually gone up.
So they were essentially outsourcing their emissions.
That's how the study saw it. They were quite critical of a proposal back then to let Switzerland offset its emissions entirely abroad, basically removing domestic targets.
So across the board in that region, the policies just weren't lining up with the science in 2019.
Not even close, according to these scientists. That mismatch is really why they felt they had to publish this statement, to highlight that disconnect with hard data.
Which leads us straight to this idea of the carbon budget. If time is running out, it means the atmosphere's capacity is too.
Precisely. The study put numbers on it. To have a high chance of staying below 1.5 degrees, the world's remaining CO2 budget at 2019 emission rates would only last about 10 more years.
Only 10 years from 2019.
Yes. For the 2-degree target, maybe 25 to 30 years. So not a lot of breathing room either way.
And the study used this really powerful term for emissions after that budget runs out. What was that again?
They called it a CO2 overdraft loan.
An overdraft loan implying debt.
Exactly. A debt that today's young people would be expected to somehow repay. It would mean huge, maybe impossible efforts later on to actively pull greenhouse gases out of the air.
So inaction today is essentially taking out a loan in the next generation's name.
That's the framing, a very tangible transfer of burden.
And that links to another major risk they flag tipping points. What happens if we push things too far?
Yeah, the worry is that as temperatures rise, we get closer to crossing these thresholds, these climatic tipping points.
Where things sort of spiral.
Exactly. Positive feedback loops kick in, and the climate shifts into a new state. The study warns that if we cross those points, getting back to today's climate could become basically impossible for future generations. The change locks in.
Irreversible on human timescales.
Pretty much. And we can't ignore the oceans in all this. They're taking a massive hit.
Right. The study mentioned they absorb something like 90% of the extra heat.
And about 30% of the CO2 we emit. which sounds helpful, but it comes at a huge cost,
Like,
like ocean acidification, rising sea levels, and serious threats to marine life. The study specifically mentioned coral reefs, which are incredibly vulnerable.
so the oceans are acting like a buffer, but they're paying a heavy price.
A very heavy price. They're literally absorbing the heat of our inaction.
Which brings us to the money side. Fact 22 in the study, citing IMF data from 2014. It talks about the sheer cost of keeping things as they were. We know governments subsidize fossil fuels directly, right?
Yeah.
Hundreds of billions a year.
Right, that's the direct money. But this study highlighted the bigger picture. When you factor in the hidden costs, health problems from pollution, damage from climate impacts.
The stuff we all end up paying for anyway.
Exactly. Those post-tax subsidies for fossil fuels globally added up to, wait for it, $5 trillion US a year.
5 trillion. Back in 2014.
5 trillion. That was about 6.5% of the entire global economy at the time.
That's just mind-boggling. We were spending a fortune subsidizing the very thing causing the problem.
A massive internal contradiction, financially speaking.
And this connects to biodiversity too, doesn't it? The study makes it clear these crises aren't separate.
No, they're deeply intertwined. The study states we're in the midst of the biggest mass extinction since the dinosaurs vanished.
How much faster are things going extinct?
They estimate extinction rates are 100 to 1,000 times faster than they were before major human influence. It's a drastic acceleration.
Wow. Did they give any specific examples of that decline?
Yes, a really stark one. Looking at vertebrate species, they studied mammals, birds, fish, reptiles, amphibians. Their average population abundance dropped by 60% just between 1970 and 2014.
60% in just over 4 decades.
Yes, it's not a slow decline. The study presents it as a rapid unraveling.
And climate change just makes it worse for wildlife already struggling.
It's a massive threat multiplier. The study warned that if CO2 emissions continued unchecked, we could lose half the animal and plant species in incredibly rich places like the Amazon or the Galapagos by 2100.
Iconic ecosystems potentially decimated.
That's the risk they laid out.
But the study wasn't all doom and gloom, right? It did talk about solutions, especially around food.
Absolutely. It didn't just diagnose the problem, it pointed towards necessary changes. A big one was shifting towards sustainable diets specifically, reducing how much meat, fish, and milk we consume.
And the logic there was about efficiency, land use.
Exactly. They had this striking comparison. Meat production uses over 80% of the world's farmland, but provides less than 20% of the calories people actually eat.
That's incredibly inefficient.
It is. So the study argued that eating more plant-based foods directly is much more efficient. It frees up land, cuts greenhouse gas emissions, and as a bonus, often has health benefits too.
Makes sense. But changing diets and farming on that scale needs policy changes, right?
Definitely. The scientists were clear. Politicians need to create the rules of the game, make climate-friendly choices easy and cheap, and make climate-damaging activities unattractive and expensive.
So things like effective carbon pricing, getting rid of those harmful subsidies we talked about.
Precisely, shift the incentives. And they also added a note of optimism, pointing out that a fully renewable energy system is financially feasible.
Because the tech is there and the costs have come down.
Right. The technology was largely established even in 2019, and costs were falling fast. The main barrier they identified wasn't technology or money, it was political will, inertia.
Okay, let's talk about the scientists themselves. The study had a section reflecting on why they felt the need to publish this. It's tricky, isn't it? Scientists usually aim for neutrality.
It is tricky, but they argued that knowing what they knew, staying silent about the risks of global environmental change would actually be irresponsible. A violation of our professional responsibilities towards our societies, as they put it.
Knowledge brings obligation.
That was their stance. They felt ethically bound to sound the alarm.
They used an analogy, didn't they, to explain why they spoke out.
Yeah, a powerful one. They compared themselves to medical experts who have a duty to warn the public about an oncoming epidemic. They saw climate change as a similar societal threat requiring a clear warning from those who understood the science.
And that explains the speed, too. Getting over 26,000 signatures in just 4 weeks.
Yes, it shows the level of consensus and urgency within the scientific community across many different fields. They felt the need to act fast.
The study also makes a point about how long we've known about this stuff. It wasn't new in 2019.
Not at all. They actually cited a U.S. government report from way back in 1965 that warned about rising sea levels from CO2 emissions. We've known the basics for over half a century.
And that long awareness leads to their final, really critical point about delaying action.
Right. They argued that putting off action doesn't just postpone the solution, it actively makes the problem worse. It means stronger climate impacts down the line.
So doing nothing is actually a choice with serious consequences.
Exactly. In their view, presented with this evidence, a non-decision, just continuing business as usual, is a decision. A dangerous one. That was the core message to policymakers in 2019.
So we've taken a deep dive today into that 2019 statement, the science that really underpinned why those youth protests were happening, and why scientists felt compelled to say, yes, their concerns are valid.
It meticulously laid out the evidence for urgent action back then.
Let's just bring back that full title one last time. The concerns of the young protesters are justified. A statement by scientists for future concerning the protests for more climate protection.
And perhaps the thought to leave you with, listener, comes directly from their core arguments. If we've known about the problem for so long, and if delaying just makes that CO2 overdraft loan bigger for future
And the
generations,
question becomes,
how do we fundamentally change our collective approach to time? Politically, economically, even individually. How do we finally manage our time in a way that meets this huge intergenerational responsibility they highlighted so clearly back in 2019?